Visayas. Let's give her a virtual applause to Engineer Maria Elena Limen-Diez. Morning, Mom.
Thank you so much to our very energetic host, Sir Jay. Good morning, Sir Jay. And of course, good morning to our participants. And I believe our Assistant Regional Director also, ARD Romanillos, is here on behalf of RD Seni Campita. And of course, the speaker a while ago, Engineer Aranas. And of course, our Executive Director, Engineer Noel Sibinac. And thank you so much, Region 5, for inviting us, Sir James, and all our participants. Good morning, everyone. So allow me to share with you my PowerPoint presentation. Okay, I'd just like to verify if my presentation is already showing on your screen.
Yes, Ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Sir Jay. So again, this morning I am tasked to discuss with you in detail, or not so in detail, a little bit detailed about how to go about with your chemical safety program. So a while ago, Engineer Aranas have mentioned already the elements of the chemical safety program, which is actually iterated on Department Order 136 series of 2014. Now, for the rationale of this particular session or for this particular program, why there is a need for us to implement or to formulate chemical safety in our chemical safety program in our workplaces. So basically, chemicals have become a part of our life, sustaining many of our activities, preventing and controlling many diseases, and increasing agricultural productivity. However, well, one cannot ignore that many of these chemicals may, especially if not properly used, endanger our health and poison our environment. And we have seen so many accidents in years involving exposure to different chemicals, especially hazardous chemicals. Now, chemicals are widely used throughout our society. It's vital in all our day-to-day life, in all our processes. But of course, it has both positive and negative impacts on health or effects on health, well-being, socioeconomic aspect, and the environment. Though significant progress has been made in chemical management, diba? Government natin has been formulating different orders, different policies and regulations just to ensure that workers will be safe when they become exposed to different chemicals. So, but the protection of workers from the exposure to hazardous substance has always been a major concern. Now, thus, the Department of Labor and Employment have issued these statutes in the form of department order. And one of these is, as mentioned, the Department Order 136 series of 2014, where in Section 7 has detailed the chemical safety program elements required for the private sector to formulate and implement. So that is the minimum requirement. So hindi sinasabi na hindi, you cannot improve it. You have to improve it. You can. Those items being mentioned on Section 7 are the minimum requirement. So yun yung maging basis natin or initial footing natin when we are going to formulate our chemical safety program. Now, for our objective, okay, the need for a safe and sound management of chemicals at work is to meet the following objectives. First, I believe this has been mentioned also already, but I have to reiterate the reason why we have to formulate and make sure that our program is being implemented are because of the following: to protect workers from the hazards of chemicals. Okay, hazardous chemicals at work, this includes impurities, byproducts, and intermediates, and waste that may be formed and are evaluated to determine their hazards and their effects to the workers. Second is, of course, to prevent or reduce the incidence of chemically induced illnesses and injuries resulting from the use of chemicals at work. Now here, we have to ensure, or the employer must ensure, the provided informations and mechanisms are being obtained from their supplier, because it is the supplier who usually gives the information about the specific hazard and other information about the chemicals that we use in our workplaces. So information about the chemicals used at work to enable them to implement effective program, because that will be the basis on the elements of their program, on the information that comes from the supplier of the chemical that they use in their workplaces. And of course, number 3, it is also important, or our objective, to enhance the protection of the general public and the environment. Because when an industry uses chemical, it doesn't just affect the workers in the workplace, but it also affects the general public. It also have effect on the environment. So we also have to consider that when we are going to make our chemical safety program. Now let's just discuss some few of the terms that has been defined on DO 136. Chemical substance means any organic or inorganic substance of a particular molecular identity, including any element or uncombined chemical and any combination of such substance, or any mixture of two, of course, excluding radioactive materials, because there's specific requirement for radioactive materials. Exposure, this refers to the amount of chemical that is available for absorption in the body through possible routes of entry into the human body. Example, the routes of exposure of our workers to different chemicals is through inhalation. That is the number one routes of entry of these chemicals to the human body. Next is we have through ingestion. Next is through skin absorption. Now, hazardous materials or substance refer also to materials or substance in the solid, liquid, or gaseous forms known to constitute toxic, flammable, corrosive, oxidizing, and radioactive properties. Then hazards, of course, all of you here are safety officers most likely, or if not in the field or profession of safety and health, you already know this, okay? So, but nonetheless, I'm going to define this. Hazard of chemicals, inherent characteristics of chemical substance or mixture that exists in the workplace and in the environment, regardless of quantity, that are potentially dangerous or which have the capacity to harm. Example, its capacity that is inherent in it to interfere with normal biological processes, capacity to burn, its capacity to corrode, capacity to explode, and so many other capacity of these chemicals that they have inherent capacity with them. Then we have here for section 8, I'll just run down as discussed already earlier, the elements of your this is the minimum requirement for your chemical safety program. Okay, so first is you have the facilities, you have to look into facilities and the control measures, workers' right to know, storage requirements and inventory, waste management, information and training, personal protective equipment, work environment monitoring, occupational health and medical surveillance, emergency preparedness and response. Now let's move on with setting up our chemical safety program. So this is an information on how you can start or how you go about with your chemical safety program if you do not have your chemical safety program yet. So we have here 4 elements I have included here. First is your written policy and the cooperation. Second, or 2, is the arrangement on the safe use of chemicals. 3, arrangement to deal with chemical incidents. And 4 is the evaluation and the monitoring of your program. Now let's discuss the requirement of the written policy and cooperation. So A, for your policy statement, it states that every enterprise should have a clear policy on the safe management of chemicals, that should be made known to the managers, workers, and those who deal with the enterprise. So it must be communicated to all level of workers in the establishment or in the enterprise. Next is we have the duties of our employers, as mentioned earlier. Okay, so ensure the development and implementation, the monitoring of the workplace policy and program on safety in the use of chemicals. Ensure that all chemicals are properly labeled or marked and accurate safety data sheets are provided. Provide necessary control measures with the appropriate information, education, and training. Establish and implement chemical emergency response plan to mitigate accidents, and of course, ensure that the safety officer is in charge of the overall responsibility for chemical safety in the establishment. Now, this includes specific responsibility to perform regular inspections of the premises, so to check on the labeling and handling and disposal of the chemicals, and also provide technical advice regarding chemical safety rules and procedures. So those are the duties of our employers. So again, to mention the duties, they should be written in your policy, okay, in your program. The general duties of the workers: comply with the policy and programs on the safe use of chemicals, take all reasonable steps to eliminate or minimize risk to themselves and to others from the use of chemicals at work. So we're not just talking about safety of himself, but we're talking also the safety of others. It's our moral obligation to make sure that others are also safe. Observe proper use of all safeguard and safety devices. So if provided, we have to make sure that workers are observing or are utilizing all those safety devices that are being provided with them by the employer. Report immediately to their supervisor any situation which they believe could be a potential risk. Now, let's proceed with cooperation. This is one of the requirements that both workers, employers, stakeholders, and of course, your OSHC committee should cooperate in the formulation and implementation of your chemical safety program. So employers in discharging the responsibility should cooperate as closely as possible with the workers and their representatives. Employers, workers, and their representatives should cooperate as closely as possible in the application of the program. Now, workers should cooperate as closely as possible with their employers in the discharge with the latter of the responsibilities and should comply with all procedures and practices relating to safety in the use of chemicals at work. Now, this has been mentioned also, the workers' right. So workers' right they have the right of refusal to work if an imminent danger situation exists in the workplace that may result to illness, injury, or death. This is also iterated or provided in the Department Order 198 series of 2018. They have the right to refuse any unsafe work, especially if there is an imminent danger. They have the right to know on the hazards in their workplace, access to training, education, and the safe use of chemicals. Now, this should form part on your orientation of your workers. So workers should be informed on the programs that you have, including the programs on chemical safety that you have instituted in your workplace or formulated. Number 2 is the arrangements on the safe use of chemicals. So arrangement for the safe use of chemicals, we have a chemical procurement procedure. Okay, so dapat meron tayo nun. The group should establish or the company should establish and monitor purchasing procedure. Now, these procedures help you keep track of what chemicals you have on hand and follow proper safety measures. So you need to consider some chemical procurement considerations when you formulate your purchasing policy, such as buy only what you need. Do not buy extra chemicals in bulk for anticipated savings. Consider disposal cost at time of purchase, because disposal cost may exceed chemical cost by 20 to 50 times. So you have buy a lot or in bulks, but it goes into waste, then that is also an expense. That's a cost, additional cost incurred on the purchase of a certain chemical. Consider handling and disposal requirements. So ensure you have adequate storage and try to use non-hazardous chemicals whenever possible. So that should be included in your policy for your procurement policy. You have to make sure also that you reduce expired stock. Negotiate expiration dates of chemicals with your supplier, and order reagents only in quantities needed. We have seen so many schools who are storing chemicals that are in bulk and chemicals that are not being used anymore for so many years. And that is hazardous for our, not just for the workers in the laboratories, but includes on the people within that particular area. So you need to set minimum requirements on suppliers. You have to ensure that your supplier provides the safety data sheets as much as possible, if it is possible, in local language, line with GHS labeling standard, in order to adhere to relevant regulations. So in our case, we already have DO 136, so you have to make sure that our safety data sheets is also aligned with that, because that is a standard as required by globally harmonized system, and we should be compliant with that. Now, we also have to consider that use older stock first, diba? In manufacturing, we always have this motto, first in, first out policy. That is applicable also to chemicals. Or you can also make it a first expire, first out policy, if applicable. So whichever is applicable, you can use either of this policy. And you need to assess chemicals inventory system. So dapat meron po tayo. You should have your chemical inventory system for you to be able to know what are the chemicals you have in your storage room. And of course, it is really important that you know the quantity of these chemicals. So that will fall through on our next slide, which is the chemical inventory. Okay, so you have to initiate the development of facility-wide chemical procurement system to enable department to screen orders against what is already in stock. So if you have different sections, different departments, it is much recommended that only one procurement or a purchasing department who will handle all your necessities in terms of chemical requirements. Next is you have to make sure that you have your chemical inventory. So make a master inventory system for all chemicals used in the company. You also have to consider the frequency and tracking of the chemical inventory. So it varies from one company to the other. Okay, it depends on you. You have to determine on how often you're going to track, on how often you're going to conduct your chemical inventory. So it varies from one company to the other. It's not the same across all companies. So moving on is for you to conduct the hazard identification. Now that you have already your inventory of your chemicals, we need to make sure that we're going to conduct hazard identification. So after reviewing the chemicals being used at work, obtaining all the information about their hazards is very necessary. So you have to make sure, as mentioned a while ago, that it should be part of your procurement policy, that when you purchase chemicals, together with that is the supplier should supply the safety data sheet for that particular chemical. So you can refer to your safety data sheet for the hazards associated with that particular substance or chemical that you have purchased. So from there, you will be able to identify the hazards. So SDS, or formerly known, most of us would know it as the material safety data sheet, but as mentioned a while ago by Engineer Aranas, it has been changed already to universal safety data sheet. So it includes information such as the properties of each chemical, the physical health and environmental health hazards, protective measures is there, safety precautions for handling, storing, and transporting the chemicals is also there. So it provides guidance for each specific chemical on things such as PPE, first aid procedures, spill cleanup procedures. Actually, there is, as per GHS, it should be 16 elements for your safety data sheet. So that will be a good source of information if we're going to do our hazard identification. Next is the classification of your chemicals. So it's very important that we have to classify our chemicals. So kung ano-ano may mga chemicals meron tayo. So classify them, of course, under GHS standard. Identify the relevant data concerning the hazard of the chemical. You have to determine if the chemical is hazardous based on its physical hazards, chemical hazards, and the environmental hazards. Or you also have to consult scientific evidence to determine how the above information classifies the material. Identify each of the hazard classes that apply to each chemical. And of course, identify the appropriate hazard category. Because when we talk about chemicals, there are different categories for these chemicals. If you're going to read in detail, in depth, the GHS, you will be amazed on the different categories of these chemicals. So you have to make sure that you refer to this hazard category and within each class for the chemical to identify its severity. So very necessary that we have to identify, because we will need that in assessing the risk of our workers when they will be exposed to that particular hazard. So as mentioned, that is essential in the evaluation and assessment of the risk. So next is this. I will just run down the different classification of chemicals. So we have here classification of chemicals in terms of physical hazard. But if you want to know in detail, please refer to the GHS manual. We're using now revision 7. Okay. So for your physical hazard, you have, it could be explosive, flammable, oxidizers, gas under pressure, self-reactive, pyrophorics, self-heating peroxides, and it could also be corrosives. Then we also have health hazard, acute toxicity, skin corrosion, irritant, sensitizer, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, target organ or systemic toxicity, and aspiration toxicity. We also have chemicals classified in terms of its environmental hazard. So it could be hazardous or acute aquatic toxicity, or its chronic aquatic toxicity. Now, after identifying the different hazards and classifying the chemicals, we may now proceed with the evaluation and risk assessment. So here you can use the monitoring of your workplace. So it's actually stated in Rule 1070, the work environment monitoring. So we can implement that. Employers should monitor and record the exposure of workers to hazardous chemicals to ensure their safety and health. Now, airborne concentrations of the hazardous chemicals should be measured in all places of work. So you can request with the Occupational Safety and Health Center for work environment measurement, because that is one of our technical service. Okay, so we do conduct work environment measurement. Then we also have here sampling equipment should be compatible with the analytical methods available and should have been validated. So it's really important that all our equipments used when we talk about work environment measurement, they are calibrated. Okay, so we have to make sure that the margin of error is very low. Okay, the precision of that particular equipment is very high. So determine the distribution of an airborne chemical throughout the general atmosphere of the working area and to identify problems and priorities. So it's really important that you have to conduct, I believe every one of you has undergone already the training training for safety officer, if not training on industrial hygiene. So part of that discussion is the work environment measurement. And we really emphasize that the importance of work environment measurement is for us to be able to prioritize. We need to prioritize as which among the chemical or hazard needs an immediate action. So it's really important that we have to use this through the work environment measurement. So from the result, we will be able to identify the problems and determine which to prioritize among this. Then we also have the personal monitoring. So here, for workers who have direct exposure to the chemicals, so if you have you're handling the chemicals directly, you're mixing chemicals or you're transferring chemicals, or it's part of your activity, personal monitoring should be used to evaluate the risk of exposure to the individual worker. Air samples should be collected in the worker's breathing zone by means of personal samplers. So it's important if the worker is exposed directly to the source of these chemical hazards that we have to use personal monitoring instead of the area monitoring. Now, assessing the risk, you have to compare your results to the exposure limits or the exposure criteria for evaluation. So in our case, we have the table number 8. Okay, so if you are familiar with table 8 of the Occupational Safety and Health Standard, that is for the threshold limit values of airborne contaminants, wherein the TLB for chemicals or substances is actually defined as a concentration in air, typically for inhalation or skin exposure. Its units are in parts per million or ppm for gases and in milligram per cubic meter for particulates such as dust, smoke, and the mist. So you can use this. Another source is the information on the intrinsic health and physical hazard obtained from the chemical safety data sheet. If you have noticed, if you have safety data sheets in your workplace, if you are using chemicals, together with it also, you can check there is the threshold limit values for that particular chemicals. But of course, we have to refer first to our occupational safety and health standard because that is what is required in the Philippines. That is the minimum requirement. Now, assessment of risk from harmful chemicals, including monitoring where appropriate, should be made as soon as the plant and equipment are installed in order to determine whether the criteria established by the government has been met. So we have to make sure that assessment of the risk has been conducted. Next is you have to estimate the exposure and risk based on the method of work and the work pattern. So sometimes it varies on what is the method you're using in your company in terms of using of chemicals. What are the practices you have? So you have to check also because this will affect the risk of the workers in dealing with chemicals. You can also seek the advice from the supplier. So suppliers, sometimes they have this informations, experiences from different users. So you have to refer also experiences of exposure in the workplace and of other users, diba? So because other users who have been using the chemicals have already experienced. Sometimes they know what are the risks associated with that particular chemical. So that could also be your reference when you do your risk assessment. So next is we have the assessment of risk should also take into account the following. So we have to make sure that the quantity of the chemical present at the workplace, you have to address that. You have to check on that. The operating conditions and processes applied at the workplace. What are the processes? What are the process involves when you use chemicals, because that could probably produce another products or intermediate products that could be hazardous to our workers. So the range of uses of chemicals for which the employer is responsible, which might include production, handling, storage, transport, and including the disposal. Still with the evaluation and risk assessment. Now, here is we have to assess the risk and we have to take into this account also, additional on the previous slide, the variety of tasks that contribute to a work activity, particularly those where the engineering controls provided are not available. So activities, for example, during certain maintenance activity, okay, so there are sometimes when you do maintenance activity, sometimes there are no control measures in place. Breakdown or cleaning tasks. So you have to check also with this. The nature of the chemical and whether the hazards and associated risks are increased by the way it is used. So as I mentioned a while ago, so you have to check also for chemicals subjected to heat, for example. So they might change their composition, they might create another substance and might be much hazardous to the original chemical that you have been using. You have to check also if there is a process of dilution or when mixed with other substances. You have to analyze this particular situation because other hazards might be created when these activities, when you use those chemicals are involved. The consequences and the likelihood of a possible failure or sequence of failures of the control measures provided. So you have to consider also, these are the time when you have to ask questions such as what if, okay, what will happen under what circumstances? So you have to make sure that you answer also those questions. Now let's proceed with control measures. So as mentioned, after prioritizing those hazards, we can formulate our control measures. So I believe everybody knows what is the hierarchy of controls. I need not reiterate that because I know all of you knows the hierarchy of controls. Okay, so here, elimination and substitution. So after assessing the risk, there is a need to establish and implement control measure. So employers should include in their assessment consideration as to whether the risk from the hazardous chemicals used can be eliminated. So first is you think about elimination. So we can check. So ceasing the use of the chemical, would that be possible? Can you stop the use of that particular chemical for you to be able to eliminate the hazards associated with that chemical? Next is replacing them by less hazardous chemicals or by the same substances in less hazardous form. So you may change the form of that particular chemicals or phase, or you can also check if you can use it in lesser concentration. Would that be possible for your process? So that is substitution. So care should be taken to consider all the known risks of the proposed substitutes. So kung meron man tayong chemicals, if there will be another chemical that will be substituted with the current chemical that you are using. And action should be taken on precautionary measure before substitution. So you also have to check, to do a risk assessment if that particular substitute or that chemical that you will use for the substitution of the existing chemicals is indeed of less hazard compared to the existing one, or using an alternative process. So there might be other process wherein the byproducts are not being produced, but still you use the same chemicals. No intermediate chemicals are being produced that are hazardous. So you just have to check because there might be other alternative process that you can use. So you can use that as one of your control measures in elimination and substitution. Now, next is we have control measures for chemicals hazardous to health. So workers should be protected against, sorry for that. Workers should be protected against the risk of injury or disease from the chemical hazardous to health. Workers should not be exposed to chemical hazardous to health, in particular to an extent which exceeds exposure limits or other exposure criteria for the evaluation. So you just refer to our standard for the limits, allowable limits for your exposure to that particular chemical or substance for you to be able to know if that exceeds already. Now let's proceed with control measures to provide protection for workers. Could be any of the combination of the following. We can institute good design and installation practice. Now, totally enclosed processes and handling systems. So containment of a hazard is best achieved by fully enclosing, diba? Fully enclosing the processes involving the use of chemicals. Full enclosure of processes can be more easily achieved where plant and equipment are automated or operated remotely. But what if it's not automated? So definitely workers will be exposed to that particular hazard of that chemical. Now, plant and equipment should be designed and installed to contain or minimize the risk from chemicals used at work. So you have to make sure that it is designed and installed. This is somewhat to minimize the exposure of our worker to that particular chemical. By reducing the release of harmful or flammable chemicals, including the vapor and dust from such chemicals. Now, to reduce leaks, for example, there are some processes when you use chemicals, it results to leak of that chemical. So where practicable, where particularly hazardous chemicals are used, enclosed plant and equipment should be fitted with extraction system. So which should be designed to ensure a slight negative pressure within the plant and equipment where the process allows. So in this case, we do not want or we will not allow the dispersion of the chemicals or of the hazard generated from that chemicals to be distributed or to be dispersed into the working environment of our workers. Now, the segregation of the hazardous process from the operators or from other processes, diba? It's really essential. It's necessary to further reduce the risk from the hazardous chemicals. Plants, equipment, and storage should be separated from other processes, especially if these processes do not use chemicals. So you have to make sure that they are isolated, they are separated. Now, for incompatible chemicals and other chemicals which may cause a hazard in the event of fire from premises of offsites and other areas outside the control of your company. So in that case of flammable, you have to make sure that you have to look into other control measures so as your workplace will not be affected. Okay. So plant processes or work systems which minimize the generation of or suppresses or contained hazardous of production of dust and fumes is highly recommended. Okay, so example, you have to design and construct to contain these chemicals, limiting the effects by means of suitable sized and designed pressure relief vents, and methods that will prevent or reduce the spread of this chemical. That is very important. That's the reason why we have to make sure that the hazards being generated by these chemicals are contained. As much as possible, we do not want these chemicals to reach the breathing zone of our workers. Now, partial enclosure with local exhaust ventilation is one good control measures that we can implement. Where total enclosure of a process involving hazardous chemical is not reasonably practicable. So I mean to say you cannot implement that because inherent in your process that you cannot enclose the process. Local exhaust ventilation equipment should be provided and maintained to ensure that criteria such as exposure limits specified by our standard are not exceeded and that hazards are eliminated and kept to minimum. So as low as practicable is the requirement for this. For local exhaust ventilation, this is a very good engineering control measures. The local exhaust ventilation should be so designed, constructed, and installed as to ensure either the safe and effective removal of contaminant in air or contaminated air from the workplace to a safe place. So you have to make sure you do not reintroduce the exhausted contaminated air in your workplace. That is a no-no, okay? Or the filtering or treatment of the contaminated air to avoid further hazard, taking into account exposure limits. Now, The performance of the local exhaust ventilation should be checked upon installation against the design specification. So if you happen to know, the center is also conducting industrial ventilation trainings. So if you can join those trainings, it's really important because you will learn in depth about ventilation systems that you can implement in your workplace. That is very good control measures when we talk about exposure of our workers to chemicals. Now, for efficient operation to prevent exposure of the worker, the exhaust ventilation should be located as close as possible to points of emission of hazards of chemicals, or from the source or the emission of the source of the hazard. The length of the ducting and the number of vents should be kept in a minimum to enable efficient operation. So you have to check also the design of your local exhaust ventilation, because that is very important to ensure that the ventilation system you have installed is highly efficient. That is crucial in the design stage of your ventilation system. Of course, you can check if that is being implemented in your workplace. Another is we also have the requirement for sufficient general ventilation. So I believe most of you knows when to use the local exhaust ventilation and when to use the general ventilation. So for work areas, for this sufficient general ventilation, work areas should be supplied with clean air to balance the volume of extracted air as it is exhausted to the various extraction systems. So this ensures efficient extraction and helps to reduce the concentration of the chemical. So by the word itself, dilution, when you dilute, you reduce the concentration of the chemical or the hazard in your air. So that is dilution. So the flow rates of general ventilation should be sufficient to change the air of the work area according to the safety and health requirements, taking into consideration its size, okay, the size, the working conditions, and the number of workers. So if you have noticed that the occupational safety and health standard emphasizes, or we have the requirement on how many air exchange is required per day, per hour per worker. So you may refer to that particular requirement. So recirculation of extracted air, as mentioned earlier, is a no-no. Okay, so you have to make sure that it is being avoided. Kasi nga, it's already contaminated. So why will you introduce it again into your work area? So you have to make sure that there is no reintroduction of this exhausted air. Now let's proceed. Another control measure is control measures for chemicals that are hazardous to health. So we have here, I have enumerated some of this. So for your work systems and practices, so reduction of the number of workers exposed and exclusion of non-essential access. So only those workers who are really in need or who should be in that workplace should be allowed access to that particular area, especially if there is the use of these hazardous chemicals. Reduction in the period of exposure of workers, especially if you have noticed that the threshold limit values or the level or concentration of this hazard in your working environment is already rising. Okay, so you have to limit the exposure of your worker. Regular cleaning of contaminated walls and surfaces, because chemicals might be accumulated in your walls and surfaces, especially if your surfaces have crevices. Okay, it's not smooth. So you have to make sure that you have a schedule, regular schedule on cleaning your work areas, your surfaces. This includes also basic housekeeping, diba? It's essential, basic housekeeping. Use and proper maintenance of engineering control measures. So you have to make sure na all your engineering control measures, such as your local exhaust ventilation, after installation, you have to make sure that you have programs on periodic maintenance, periodic cleaning of that particular engineering control measures. Hindi pwede na you have installed it and you're going to check it if it's already defective. Okay, so you have to make sure you have to have your maintenance procedure and schedule. Provision of means of safe storage and disposal of chemicals that are hazardous to health. So you have to consider that as well. Now let's proceed with the personal protection. So personal protection, suitable personal protective equipment should be provided until such time as the risk is eliminated or minimized to a level that would not pose threat to health. Remember, personal protective equipment is your last line of defense, diba? So while waiting for your engineering control measures and other control measures, you can provide personal protective equipment, or if not, on top of the existing engineering control measures and other control measures that you have, you can provide suitable personal protective equipment to your workers. That will augment the safetiness of our workers. Then, of course, prohibition of eating, chewing, drinking, and smoking in contaminated areas, because that will expose the worker to the chemicals, and there's a possibility of the ingestion of chemicals. So we have to make sure that your eating area is away from the area wherein the chemicals are being used. Next is provision of adequate facilities for washing, changing and storing of clothing, including arrangements for laundering contaminated clothing. So if you are dealing with highly toxic chemicals, you have to make sure that this clothing that they wear inside the production area should not be brought outside, because they are going to bring these hazards outside from their working area. So you have to make sure that you have arrangements for the storage of these chemicals. If not, you have to provide arrangements for laundering this particular contaminated clothings. Then use of signs and notices. Adequate arrangements in the event of an emergency is also an additional necessity. Next is we have the control measures for flammable, dangerous, and reactive or explosive chemicals. So similarly with what we have discussed a while ago, for chemicals that are hazardous to health, good design and installation practice is also important. Elimination or control of the sources of ignition. So we all know what are the sources of ignition, so we have to make sure that these are being eliminated. Example of ways in which sources of ignition may be eliminated include the following: setting up and maintenance of no smoking areas. So you have to make sure that workers do not smoke in areas wherein chemicals are being used, especially if these chemicals are flammable, highly reactive chemicals, or if not, they are explosive. So it's a no-no that people will smoke or workers will smoke near that particular area where these chemicals are being used. There should be a prohibition of pumps and other electrical apparatus with the bonded areas of storage tanks. Okay, the pump should be located in the own containment area in case of leakage. So you have to make sure, because there is the formation of static electricity when there are flammable substances that are being transferred from one container to the other. You also have to make sure that there will be prohibition of electrical motors within ducts that contain flammable chemicals. Example, replacing them with remote-driven fans. That's a good option when we talk about control measures. And prohibition of battery charging operations for forklift trucks within the storage areas or storage buildings of our chemicals. So these are some ways to eliminate the sources of ignition in our workplace to ensure that chemical or fire will not result in the use of the particular chemicals. Now, for the separation of processes that use flammable chemicals, other processes, bulk storage of flammable chemicals which may cause a hazard in the event of fire, the boundary and premises off-site, which are not under the control of the employer, and some other fixed sources of ignition. Now, the following points should be observed where flammable chemicals are used. Here, you have to make sure that portable heaters such as oil, gas heaters, radiant electric fires, and oil-filled electric radiators should be avoided in areas where flammable substances are being used. Where oil and gas-fired systems are used, they should be of the indirect type. Okay, the product of combustion should be safely fueled to the outside atmosphere. The intake of air into such system should come from safe locations where no spillage of flammable chemicals is likely to occur and enter the heating system. Else, that would likely result to fire. Now, next is we have the provision of an inert atmosphere for totally enclosed processes and handling system. I know it's not easy. It's not easy to make your atmosphere inert. Okay. So, but if you can, that is a very good control measure that we can implement. Provision of means of fire detection and alarm, which are as far as practicable, should include automatic means of extinguishing incipient fires. So incipient fires, do not wait for the fire to be uncontrollable. In its incipient stage, we have to make sure that we do some actions already. Now let's proceed with the control measures for the transport of chemicals. Now, hazardous chemicals should be transported in accordance with the criteria established by the competent authority. So here in the Philippines, we have, of course, other authority who have the authority to look into when you transport chemicals. So for the safety of the workers involved, the criteria established by the competent authority should be consistent with the national or international transport regulations and covered as applicable. So of course, you may check with other departments, government departments, for the regulations in terms of transport of chemicals. So here, I'll just want to share this. The properties and quantities of chemicals to be transported should be taken into consideration. How bulk is that? What is the quantity that you're going to transport? How hazardous the chemical? Or the nature, integrity, and protection of the packaging and container used in transport, including piping or pipelines. So you have to make sure that it is the appropriate type of container when you transport chemicals. The specification of the vehicle used in transport. There are requirements. What type of vehicle can be used in transporting these chemicals? The routes to be taken should be considered also. Would that be land transport only, or would that include sea transport, air transport? So this should be taken into consideration as well. The training and qualification of the transport workers. For those who are transporting the chemicals, you have to include those. You have to make sure that they have the training, they are competent to handle in case of emergency. So they know what to do. You have to make sure that all these chemicals are properly labeled in accordance with GHS for transporting these chemicals. Loading and unloading. There are specific requirements when we load chemicals. So you have to make sure you check this with your safety data sheet. So sometimes there's a requirement that you have to bond it and ground it, especially if you are dealing with chemicals. So check with your safety data sheets if that is necessary also for you when you load or unload the chemicals during transport. Procedures in case of emergency. Okay, so in case of spillages, what are your procedures to consider? You have to make sure that supplies for controlling spillages and leaks are also provided as one of your resources. Next is we have the control measures for the disposal and treatment of the chemicals. Now, the chemical should also be handled, treated, or disposed in a manner which eliminates or minimizes the risk to safety and health and to the environment in accordance with the law that we have and practices, the good practices. Containers which have been emptied, which may contain residues of the hazardous chemical should be treated as hazardous as well. Okay. So there are so many cases, so many accidents that happens that the container that is being used for hazardous chemicals are not being treated as hazardous one. So what happened? Some workers would likely use this, especially for containers. We have so many accidents involving the use of containers that contain especially flammable substances. Now let's proceed with the personal protective equipment requirement. So for your PPE, of course, you have to refer to Rule 10 and 80 as mentioned. That is the Occupational Safety and Health Standard requirement for the protection of workers in terms of PPE. This includes respiratory protective equipment, protective clothing and footwear, equipment to protect the face, eyes, and hands, and equipment to prevent an accumulation of static electricity, example, anti-static footwear, especially if we have flammable substances in our workplaces. Now, effective action should be continued. It should be taken by employer to ensure that the control measures are developed and applied, because by just using PPE, that will not make sure that our worker are really safe by just providing personal protective equipment. Okay, so personal protective equipment should afford adequate protection against the risk from those hazardous chemicals to which the wearer is exposed throughout the period during which such equipment is necessary, having regard to the type of work that the worker is doing. Now, the equipment provided should be suitable for its purpose, and there should be a sufficient supply readily available in the workplace for workers who requires it. Now, workers required to wear protective equipment should be fully instructed in the use. That is why we also require that you also have your PPE program. You have to formulate your policies and program on the use and maintenance of your personal protective equipment. And workers should also be trained on how to use this PPE. Now, all personnel that is necessary for safety in the use of chemicals should be provided and maintained by the employer without the cost to the worker. So this is this is under DO 198, that all the personal protective equipment should be free of charge. It is the responsibility of the employer to provide this personal protective equipment to our workers. Of course, if they have exposure to the hazard. Now, let's proceed with the work systems and practices that you can formulate. So for your work systems and practices, work procedures should be devised and followed for all uses of hazardous chemicals at work to protect workers against the risk which have been identified as a result of the employer's assessment of risk. So you have to make sure that is linked with the assessment that has been conducted. The work procedure should incorporate the most effective use of the control measures provided. So included in your work procedures are the control measures. Okay, so how to effectively use those instituted control measures. A work procedure should be devised after other appropriate means to eliminate and minimize risk, and it should be chosen. Example, appropriate chemical, technological, and engineering control measures for a particular use at work. So depende na lang kung what is the method or the procedures or processes you have in your workplace, or the method on how you use the chemicals or how you utilize the chemicals. The work procedure should make it clear who is in charge of the work, specify the particular task included in that work, and which individuals have responsibilities where there is an overlap. Okay, and provide for the exchange of necessary information, achieve changeover every time. So it's necessary that you have to have your communication system in place, especially for if you have shifting schedules. So you have to make sure that you have an ample or you have to give time for them for their turnover. The work procedures that are devised should be in accordance with the requirements of the law. Of course, we have to make sure that we follow the standard or we follow the best practices in dealing with chemicals. So you can check. There are so many information, so many references you can check online if you want to make your work practices or work systems and practices, if you will formulate your procedures. Now here, written work procedure should be devised and followed where good work procedure and practices are of primary importance. Sometimes on top of your engineering control measures, this is somewhat you call your administrative control. So during routine maintenance, the testing, examination, and repair of plant and equipment, the transfer of chemicals, so including loading and unloading, for emergency shutdown of chemical processes. So we have to make sure that we have written work procedures for this. Sometimes we call this the non-routinary activities. So in some cases, the possible risks presented by the hazardous chemicals are very high. Example, during maintenance of plant and equipment, where entry is necessary. Okay? Lalo na pag ito sa example, confined space entry. Okay? Confined space. So there are lots of hazards that might be possible present in your confined space. So you have to make sure you have to look into this. So in such cases, a formal written procedure referred as to a work permit or permit to work system is required. So you have to check this because chemicals are considered also hazardous energies. They can be the source of these hazardous energies. So permit to work system is highly recommended for you to have. Now, it should form states exactly what work is to be done. So your permit to work, okay, you have to make sure you have the form for that, and it should state exactly what work it should be done and when and which parts are safe. A responsible person should assess the work and check safety at each stage and on completion. So you have to make sure interval monitoring is there, or if not, someone is supervising the activity. You do not leave the activity alone with one worker working in that area. So you have to develop that permitting system if you are dealing with these hazardous chemicals, especially if that involves confined space entry. Now, people doing the job should sign the permit and to show that they understand the hazards and the necessary precautions. Now, for persons working alone, particular attention should be given to work procedures and to the arrangements in the event of an emergency, and specific provisions made where appropriate. So very crucial if the worker is working alone. So we have to make sure that we have to make procedures also for that particular work. Next is the use of proper maintenance of the engineering control measure. So engineering control measures should be thoroughly examined and tested at suitable or specified intervals. Now, to ensure that they are continuing to perform as originally intended. This will also consider minimization of the qualities of chemicals handled and used. So as much as possible, if we can minimize the quantities, of the chemicals that are being kept in our workplaces, that is very good. Okay. Many standards, codes, and guidelines exist considering the storage of specific chemicals in bulk or in small containers. When smaller containers, example, if you have cylinders, sacks, or bags are used, intermixing of chemicals is liable to occur. So you have to make sure that we will not allow this to happen, because there are some chemicals that highly incompatible. Okay, they violently react with each other. So the major risk is that of fire and the resultant release of chemicals or a combustion product will produce. So many incidents of loss or injury resulting from warehouses activity have been caused by fire. So actually, we also have these experiences involving flammable substances that result to a catastrophic or if not large loss on the part of the employer or the company. Then, of course, we have the minimization of the quantities of chemicals handled and used, separation of arrangements for storing chemicals from normal processes activities. So here, safe setting of storage areas in order to minimize the effects of an incident. Storage areas for chemicals should be kept separate from the process areas. So you have to make sure that bulk storage of your chemicals should not be, they should not be stored. I mean, the bulk chemicals should not be stored in your process area. You have to make sure that there is a specific storage area for these bulk chemicals. Now, occupied buildings and other storage areas, as well as from boundaries and off-site premises over which the employer has no control, and fixed sources of ignition. So, except for a small quantity of hazardous chemicals stored in a workplace in a safe manner. So, kaya sabi natin, you have to make sure you identify kung gaano ba karami ang chemicals na kailangan mo in a day. So, you have to make sure that the chemical you store in your area is as what is needed for that particular day only or activity. Okay, so do not store bulk chemicals in your workplaces. Next is we have separation of incompatible chemicals. Diba? On our first step, we have to classify the chemicals. So here you have to make sure that you separate incompatible chemicals. So chemicals that can react together to form unstable or noxious products or produce heat should be kept separate and in the appropriate construction. The nature and integrity of the storage container should be taken into consideration. Okay, reduction of the number of workers exposed and exclusion of non-essential access, ensuring that appropriate equipment is also provided. Now let's move on with adequate washing facilities. So clothing accommodations should be provided when protective clothing is used or when there is a risk of decontamination. Changing facilities should be situated and designed as to prevent the spread of contamination from protective clothing to personal clothing and from other facility to another. So we have to make sure we prevent these chemicals from being dispersed or distributed or transferred to other working areas and even to our clothings, because the clothing that we have or we will be using that in going home. So we might be bringing those chemical hazards to our family. So it's a no-no. You have to make sure that those chemicals that are contaminated, I mean, those clothing that are contaminated with chemicals should not be brought outside our workplaces. Okay? So next is we have, you have to ensure that you also have the information and training, because this is really one of the elements of your chemical safety program, as I iterated a while ago, as mentioned. Workers should be informed of the hazards associated with chemicals used at their workplace. That is also mandatory based on Department Order 198. So workers should be informed on these particular hazards that they are being exposed to in dealing with chemicals. Should be instructed about how to obtain the use and use the information provided on labels and chemical safety data sheets. Should be trained in the correct and effective use of the control measures. Should be trained on the continuing basis in the working system and practices to be followed. So all those policies and programs, safe work procedures that you have, workers should be informed about it. Okay, so you have to make sure that it is being disseminated to all our workers so that they will take precautions. Of course, they will implement that, because it is the workers who's going to implement all these safe work procedures that we are going to formulate in our workplaces. Now, next is the requirement for the labels and markings. Okay, so should establish requirements for the markings and labelings of chemicals to enable persons handling or using chemicals to recognize and distinguish between them. So both when receiving and when using them, so that they may be used safely. So refer also to the GHS labeling system for the appropriate pictograms, warning signs that you need to use in the event that you have chemicals in your workplace that need to be labeled and marked. Next is you have to formulate your waste management system. So ano ba yung maging programa natin dyan? Okay, so safe methods for disposal of chemicals of contaminated packaging which may contain residues of hazardous chemicals should be given consideration. You may refer also to DNR administrative orders. Meron silang yung implementing rules and regulations for RA 6969, also known as the Toxic Waste and Hazardous and Nuclear Waste Control Act of 1990. So you just have to refer if you're going to make your procedure or guidelines on the waste management in your workplace. Please don't forget to refer to DNR Administrative Order or the DOW for the implementation of hazardous waste in the workplace. Now let's proceed with the arrangement. Okay, so number 4, arrangement. This is actually number 4. Sorry for that. Arrangement for chemical incidents. First is you have to make sure you have your emergency procedures and first aid. So for your emergency procedure, these arrangements, including the procedures to be followed, should be kept up to date in the light of new information such as that provided in chemical safety data sheets, experience with the chemicals, and any changes in the work activity. So workers should be trained in the relevant procedures. This should describe arrangement for raising the alarm. So when are you going to raise an alarm in terms of an accident that involves chemicals, such as in accidental release of chemicals, or large spillage of chemicals, there is leak of chemicals, especially if these are hazardous chemicals or highly toxic chemicals. Arrangements for calling of appropriate emergency assistance. So whether in plant or off-site, so you have to make sure you have those arrangements or you have your procedures on how to appropriately seek assistance internally if you have your chemical spill team, for example, or your responders. Then you also have to consider off-site help, because there are times that we cannot take care of those emergencies if that involves large considerations or large amount of chemicals. So sometimes we need external help. So you have to make sure that you have arrangements for that. The use of appropriate personal protection and its limitations. So you have to make sure you consider what are the appropriate PPE necessary in case of emergency. So the best reference for this is your safety data sheets. So you refer to your safety data sheet for the appropriate PPE required in case of emergency for that particular chemical or substance that you will be using. Still with emergency procedure, the evacuation of the work area, premise or establishment, and the location of emergency exits and escape routes. So you can actually incorporate it together with your evacuation routes. Diba? It's just the same. So if you have assembly point in case of fire, so the same also if you have chemical emergencies, you can utilize that same assembly point. Then action to minimize the incident. It's very important. Example, tackling the fire, controlling the leaks, okay, and spills, emergency shutdown, removable of portable pressure vessels in case of fire, and action specifically prohibited if persons are put at risk. So the evaluation nearby premises is also necessary. Okay, so you have to look into this aspect in order for you to be able to formulate your own emergency procedure, because emergency procedures and all these procedures instructions is plant specific. Okay, it varies from one company to the other. Still with emergency procedure. So in some cases, it will be necessary to provide for emergency procedures in the event of foreseeable incident from adjacent work activities or adjacent establishment. So you also have to consider there might be other sources aside from the hazards that you have inside your workplace. Other, like for example, if there are companies, other companies within your vicinity that produces also or utilizes also hazardous chemicals, that in case of emergency in their workplace, it might affect also your work area or your workplace. So you have to consider that as well. Okay. So example is to cool vessels or other containers from overpressurization in the event of a fire nearby. So you have to consider that. to stop processes and leave plant and equipment in a safe condition in the event of a chemical release from an adjacent plant or site. Okay, so we also have to consider that, especially if the location of your company or your workplace is in highly industrialized area wherein almost all of you are using hazardous chemicals. So you have to take into consideration this as well. Now, next is for your first aid. Of course, we all know that there is a requirement that all establishment should have a trained first aider. So required po yon sa Department Order 198. So for our first aid, adequate first aid arrangement should be provided. So as far as is practicable, appropriate means and trained personnel for rendering first aid should be readily available at all times. So specifically, if you have chemicals, these are first aid who have the knowledge on how to deal when worker is exposed to chemical. For example, incidental ingestion of chemicals. So one should be trained on how to deal with that particular situation or incident. Or if not, excessive absorption on the skin of a certain chemical. So you should have your personnel trained to render first aid in case such incident occur in your workplace, and any relevant procedures associated with sending a casualty to hospital. So there are times that cannot be taken care of with just your first aid, that needs a higher level of care. So you have to make sure that you provide procedures also in dealing this particular incident that needs to be brought to the hospital. First aid equipment and facilities should be appropriate for dealing with the hazards. I believe some of you already have this. Okay, emergency showers and eye wash stations. The only problem we usually see this is they are way too far from the area where the chemical are being used. So you have to make sure that is within a second reach only to our workers, because in case of emergency, they can easily go to that area. Okay, so baka masyadong malayo yung mga emergency showers and eye wash station natin. So instead of instead of protecting the workers or reducing the risk to the worker, mas lalong lalala yung magiging epekto doon sa worker natin. Okay? So next is we have for your firefighting, of course, that this could actually be included in your emergency response team. So you have to consider also that your firefighters are trained on especially if you have hazardous chemicals, flammable chemicals. So they are trained also on how to deal with this particular type of fire, okay, fire involving chemicals. So firefighting, adequate equipment should also be covered on site and transport and storage. Portable firefighting extinguishers should be readily available in the area where there is the possibility of having a fire or the fire hazard is there. Firefighting equipment should be readily available and located in accordance with the national law. You can refer, of course, to the revised code natin on the implementation of the Fire Code of the Philippines. Okay, so one of our resource speaker during the NOSH Congress. So you can check on that particular discussion. You can use that as your guide, or you can refer, of course, to the implementing rules and regulations for the Fire Code. So you can use that because there is a specific requirement, especially for chemicals. So you have, that is a good reference. Okay, so equipment used for fighting fires at storage facilities should be there. Ensuring adequate cooling of containers exposed to heat from a nearby fire. Firefighting and fire protection equipment should be maintained in full working order. Suitable training, instruction, and information should be given to the workers. Now, the proper use of appropriate personal protective equipment in case of fire should be there. Adequate information to enable adequate precautions to be taken should be given to trained firefighters and other emergency responders coming from offsite about the nature of the chemical fire and its hazard, especially if the fire cannot be controlled within the organization, that you need third party. So you have to make sure that the information is readily available in case there will be help coming from outside. Now let's proceed with the investigation and reporting of accidents and of course occupational diseases and incidents. We all know that we have mandatory reports and it's a requirement. All establishments should submit their report. So for accidents, we have a form for that. If we have accidents in our workplace and there is a prescribed period as to when to submit your reports. So here, investigation of accident and other incidents. Accidents and other incidents, whether or not they cause bodily injury, should be recorded and should be investigated. So sabi nila, even the near miss, you have to consider that when you do investigation. Suspected and confirmed cases of occupational disease, situations where workers have removed themselves from danger. So you have to conduct investigation in that particular case. And other situation where there may be an unacceptable risk involving hazardous chemicals. Now, reporting of accidents, as mentioned already, accidents, occupational diseases, or other accidents involving hazardous chemicals should be reported using the prescribed form. Okay, you can download those forms from the Bureau of Working Conditions and other DOLE websites, including occupational safety and health websites. Next is for your medical surveillance. Medical surveillance is necessary. Okay, so this is actually under Rule 1960. Whenever workers are liable to be exposed to chemical hazards to health, necessary as part of the protection of workers exposed to chemical hazards to health, and medical surveillance will actually assist in the early detection of ill health effects. Diba? It's really important. And of course, the last is evaluation and monitoring. We need to evaluate how effective is our program. So we have to monitor it as well. So this is the last stage in your chemical safety program, the evaluation and monitoring. So evaluate and monitor the effectiveness of your program. So you check if there is a decrease in the chemical incidences, because that will be an indication that your program is effective. There is an improvement in productivity. It's one way to detect that your program is effective. It will also improve the company image. And of course, this is the #1 priority. This is one of the #1 objective. Workers are always safe and healthy. Okay, so we have to check, we have to evaluate and monitor if indeed our workers are safe and healthy. Okay, so with that, lahat po tayo ay pwede maging OS champions. Thank you so much and good morning, everyone.
Thank you, Engineer Ellen, for that wonderful discussion. So, expert na expert si Ma'am pagdating sa field na ito dahil siya talaga yung chemical engineer ng Occupational Safety and isa sa mga chemical engineers ng Occupational Safety and Health Center. So, maraming salamat, Engineer Ellen. And let me award this certificate to you, Ma'am Ellen. So, ayan. Department of Labor and Employment and Occupational Safety and Health Center, Region 5, Certificate of Appreciation to Engineer Maria Elena, Limen-Diez, in grateful recognition for his invaluable and unwavering support as a resource speaker during the conduct of webinar on the safe use of chemicals at the workplace held on Zoom platform and Facebook Live on October 21, 2021. Palakpakan po muli natin si Engineer Ellen. Thank you so much.